The elderly nun arrived quietly at the community hall, almost unnoticed as she stepped through the large glass doors. She moved slowly, her back slightly bent from age, and her hands clasped together as if she were holding on to something precious. People were busy inside setting up chairs, adjusting microphones, arranging banners for the charity event. No one paid much attention to the small figure in a simple gray habit who paused to take in the room. She walked with gentle steps toward the edge of the stage, where a glossy black piano stood. The instrument seemed far too grand for someone as modest as her. She didn't touch it at first. She only looked at it, almost the way someone might look at an old friend they hadn't seen in many years. For a moment, her face softened, and there was a faint spark in her eyes. One of the young volunteers noticed her standing there and hurried over. He looked stressed and tired, carrying a clipboard and wearing one of those volunteer shirts that was a little too bright. "Sorry, sister, this area is for performers only," he said kindly but firmly. The elderly nun gave a gentle smile. "I understand. I was only hoping." She hesitated, her voice soft and warm. "I was hoping I might play a small piece. Nothing long." The volunteer blinked in surprise. "Oh, well, I'm not sure that's possible. The program is already full. Everything is scheduled." He sounded apologetic, but clearly, the idea didn't seem serious to him. The nun looked small and fragile, not someone anyone would picture sitting at a grand piano on a public stage. She nodded politely. "Of course. I don't want to trouble anyone." She stepped back without argument, folding her hands in front of her as she always did. The volunteer jogged off to deal with another task, leaving her alone again. She walked to a seat near the front row and settled down quietly. She didn't look disappointed. If anything, she looked peaceful, as though she had expected this reaction. She watched as performers came in, young musicians holding sheets of music, a singer warming up her voice, a small band carrying their instruments. There was a constant buzz of activity, full of excitement and nerves. From her seat, the nun simply observed. She didn't push herself into conversations or try to convince anyone to let her play. She just sat there, hands folded, eyes soft, taking in the lively scene around her. A few audience members had begun to gather early. Some noticed the nun sitting alone. Two women near the aisle whispered to each other. "Do you think she's waiting for someone?" one asked. "I think she wanted to perform," the other replied. "Maybe she knows him or something." They exchanged a small chuckle, not out of cruelty, but out of simple assumption, like many people make without thinking. The nun heard them, but she didn't react. Her expression remained calm, even gentle. She had lived long enough to recognize harmless chatter from true judgment, and these two were simply curious people making guesses. Lights around the hall flickered as technicians tested equipment. Microphones hummed. The director of the event, a serious-looking woman with a headset, rushed around organizing last-minute details. She checked the schedule repeatedly, worried because one of the highly promoted performers was stuck in traffic. The show had to stay on time, and every minute mattered. The elderly nun watched her quietly, almost sympathetically. Someone dropped a stack of papers, and the loud flutter made several heads turn. The nun was the first to lean down and help gather the sheets, handing them back to the person with a soft smile. "Thank you, sister," the young woman whispered, surprised by the nun's quick kindness. "You're welcome, dear," she replied, her voice steady and warm, even with her small gestures of kindness. No one thought to ask her again about the piano. It simply didn't cross anyone's mind. She was just an elderly nun attending an event, nothing more. At least, that was the image people formed without knowing anything about her story. She continued to sit quietly while performers took turns warming up. Some played loud, impressive chords. Others practiced fast finger exercises that made them sound professional and confident. Each time the piano sang under someone else's hands, the nun's eyes drifted toward it with gentle longing. She didn't look jealous or sad, just nostalgic, like someone remembering a distant childhood song. A little girl holding a balloon wandered away from her mother and walked toward the nun. She stopped in front of her and stared up with curiosity. "Are you going to play too?" the girl asked honestly. Children didn't make assumptions the same way adults did. The nun smiled softly and shook her head. "I don't think so, little one." "Why not?" "Well," the nun paused as if choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes people don't know what someone can do, and that is all right. Everyone has their own turn." The girl didn't quite understand, but she nodded. Then she reached out and handed the nun her balloon, as if offering comfort. The nun chuckled quietly and returned it to her. The girl waved and ran back to her mother. leaving a small moment of warmth behind her. Time passed, and the hall grew more crowded. Conversations filled the air, blending into a lively, tangled sound. But in the middle of all that, the elderly nun remained a quiet presence, unnoticed by most. Still, she watched everything closely: the musicians, the lights, the movement of staff, the piano sitting alone under the stage spotlight. Although no one around her knew it, her heart carried memories of music older than many of the people in the hall. Memories of long hours spent practicing, of stages far bigger than this, of lessons, concerts, failures, victories, and the deep joy that only a musician truly understands. But she kept all of that inside her, where it had lived quietly for many years. Someone dropped by to hand her a small cup of water, assuming she might be tired. She accepted it with a nod. "Thank you," she said gently. Then she sipped the water and looked once more at the piano. To others, it was just an instrument for the performers. To her, it was a reminder of a life she had once lived but no longer spoke about. She folded her hands in her lap, relaxed her shoulders, and waited. She didn't hope for a miracle or for someone to suddenly invite her to play. She was simply present, calm, patient, and content to watch the event unfold. Yet even so, a quiet truth lingered in her eyes. She had more inside her than anyone around her imagined, and though no one knew it yet, the day was about to change in ways none of them expected. The hall continued to fill with people, and the noise in the room grew louder as the event drew closer to starting. The elderly nun remained in her seat, her hands gently folded, watching the world move around her. Even though she sat quietly, she noticed everything. She saw the way the performers paced nervously backstage, the way the director kept checking her watch, and the way everyone seemed to be rushing towards something. She stayed calm, as if she understood that life often moved quickly, but she did not need to. The director walked back and forth near the stage, her expression tight with worry. One of the main performers, a young pianist who had been heavily promoted on the event posters, still hadn't arrived. Traffic had delayed him, and his phone kept sending short messages that he was on the way but stuck again. The director rubbed her forehead, clearly stressed. She did not have room in the schedule to adjust things. Everything was supposed to run smoothly, but things were already falling apart. Some volunteers whispered about the situation, unsure of what to do. "Should we delay the program?" one asked. "We can't," another replied. "People bought tickets. The guests are ready. The sponsors are here. We have to keep going." The nun listened quietly to their conversation. Though she didn't glance in their direction, she simply heard their worry in their voices, like soft ripples of panic spreading in the air. She closed her eyes for a moment and breathed in slowly, as if offering a silent hope for calm. Meanwhile, the performers who were present were warming up, filling the hall with bits of melodies. But beneath the notes, there was tension and uneasiness that something wasn't right. The missing pianist was supposed to be the opening act, and without him, the start of the show felt uncertain. The elderly nun watched as a young man carrying a guitar approached the director. "If you need, I can start the show," he offered. His voice was eager, maybe even a bit desperate. He looked like someone trying to take advantage of an unexpected opportunity. The director considered it for a moment but shook her head. "Thank you, but we need to stay with the original plan for now. Let's give him a little more time." The young man nodded politely, but disappointment flashed briefly across his face. He walked away, strumming a few soft chords on his guitar, more out of habit than practice. As this was happening, the nun's gaze slowly drifted back to the piano. It sat under the warm stage lights, unused and waiting. The polished surface reflected the room around it like a mirror. She watched as a small group of people gathered near it, talking quietly. They didn't notice her, of course. No one had asked her why she had wanted to play earlier. Perhaps they thought she was only being polite, or maybe they didn't think much of it at all. A pair of teenagers walked past her row discussing the performers. "I heard the pianist is amazing," one said. "He's supposed to be the highlight of the whole night." "Yeah, but if he doesn't show up, what's going to happen?" the other replied. "They can't just skip the opening. People will be upset." Their voices drifted away as they took their seats, leaving the nun alone again with her thoughts. She wasn't worried about the schedule or the missing performer. Instead, she felt a quiet understanding that life rarely went as planned, and sometimes the most meaningful moments came from unexpected changes. The lights above flickered once more as technicians ran their final checks. The speakers buzzed lightly, settling into place. The director called a quick meeting with the staff and performers, gathering them near the side of the stage. The nun watched as they formed a small circle, their heads bent together. Though she couldn't hear what they were saying, she sensed urgency in their movements. After a few moments, the group broke apart. Some rushed backstage, while others took their places near the aisles. The director walked toward the front again, her expression even more strained than before. One of the volunteers approached her cautiously. "Should we consider a backup plan?" he asked. The director let out a breath she had been holding. "We might have to, but I don't know what that plan is yet." She shook her head and walked off, leaving the volunteer standing there uncertainly. The nun lowered her gaze, her fingers resting lightly against her skirt. She didn't feel the need to approach anyone or offer suggestions. She simply sat in silence, trusting the moment as it unfolded. A soft breeze drifted from the air conditioning above, brushing against her face. She closed her eyes for a brief second, remembering the feel of stage lights on her skin from many years ago. She had once stood on brightly lit stages too, though not many people knew that story anymore. It belonged to a past that she rarely spoke of, a past she had set aside when she began a different path in life. A young boy, perhaps around 10 years old, wandered over to her seat. He held a program booklet in his hands and pointed at the picture of the grand piano printed inside. "Are you excited to hear the music?" he asked politely. She looked at him with a gentle smile. "Very much, dear. My mom says the piano player is really good," he continued. "She says he's famous." "I'm sure he is," the nun replied. "Every musician has something special to share." The boy nodded as if thinking deeply about her words, then ran back to his mother, who was calling him to sit down. The nun watched him go, her smile fading into a thoughtful expression. She wondered if the boy had ever heard someone play simply from the heart, with no thought of fame or praise. Minutes passed. The hall grew warmer with bodies and chatter. The missing pianist still had not arrived. The director tapped her headset repeatedly, trying to get updates. Her voice grew sharper each time she spoke, even from her seat. The nun could sense the stress radiating from her. Finally, the director approached the microphone at the side of the stage. She didn't turn it on yet, but she looked as though she were gathering the courage to make an announcement. A few volunteers watched her nervously, waiting for instructions. Just then, one of the technicians rushed up to whisper something to her. The director shook her head immediately. "We can't delay anymore," she said firmly. "We have to start." The technician nodded and hurried away. The director sighed heavily, then straightened her posture. Her expression shifted from stress to determination. She walked toward the microphone again, this time ready to speak to the entire audience. But before she could turn it on, another volunteer hurried up to her. "We still don't have the opening act," he reminded her quietly. "What should we do?" The director stared at the stage for a long moment, as if hoping an answer would appear out of thin air. The hall fell into an uncomfortable silence as people sensed something was wrong. Conversation slowed, heads turned toward the front. The nun watched everything, her eyes calm but observant. She could feel the tension settling into the room like a heavy blanket. Even though she had been denied earlier, she didn't feel resentment. She simply felt a quiet awareness that life sometimes opened doors in strange ways. The director finally spoke softly to her staff. "We need anyone to fill the time until he gets here. It doesn't matter who, as long as they can do something." The volunteers exchanged nervous glances. No one stepped forward. The performers who were scheduled later didn't want to go first. They weren't ready. They didn't want to take on the pressure of opening the show. For the first time since she arrived, the nun felt a small shift inside her, like the faintest tap on her shoulder from fate itself. She didn't stand or wave her hand. She simply waited. And in that waiting, she sensed that her moment, however small, might be approaching. The director continued scanning the room, her eyes searching for an answer she couldn't find. The piano sat silent under the lights, waiting for someone's touch. And somewhere in the quiet space between uncertainty and possibility, the elderly nun remained still yet ready in a way no one around her could see. The room grew quieter as the tension settled over the audience like a thin layer of fog. People shifted in their seats, whispering to one another, trying to understand why the event had stalled before it even began. The stage lights waited, warm and ready, but no performer stood behind the piano. The large grand instrument sat alone under the glow, its black surface shining like calm water. The elderly nun sat in her seat, hands folded gently in her lap. She didn't look anxious or impatient. Instead, she watched the room with quiet eyes, observing each small detail as if the moment itself were a living thing. She sensed the discomfort among the staff and the frustration building inside the director, who moved back and forth near the microphone, unsure of what to do. A few volunteers whispered urgently near the side of the stage. "We need someone to fill in," one said. "But who?" "None of the later performers want to start the show," another replied. "They're all too nervous, or their acts depend on timing." A third volunteer looked out into the audience. "There has to be someone who can help." But no one stepped forward. People simply waited, watching, unsure whether to be annoyed or understanding. In the front row, a girl tugged on her father's sleeve. "Why isn't anyone playing?" she asked. Her father sighed. "I guess they're having trouble with the schedule. Someone was supposed to start the show, but they're late." "Oh," the girl said softly. Then her eyes drifted toward the elderly nun, who sat calmly among the murmurs. "Is she waiting to play?" The father glanced at the nun, then shook his head. "I don't think so, sweetheart." The girl nodded but kept watching the nun anyway, sensing something her father didn't. Children often saw things without needing explanations. As the uneasy silence stretched on, the director finally pressed her hand against her forehead and let out a long breath. Then she stepped to the microphone, switching it on. A gentle feedback hum filled the room. The audience straightened, expecting an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice strained but steady, "we're experiencing a delay with our opening performer. We sincerely apologize and ask for your patience." Some people nodded politely. Others exchanged frustrated looks. The director continued, "We are working to adjust the program, and we appreciate your understanding." As she spoke, the nun watched her with a kind expression. Sensing the stress she carried, she could almost feel the heaviness in the director's shoulders, the worry beneath her voice. When the director stepped away from the microphone, one of the volunteers approached her. "What now?" he whispered urgently. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "We just need someone to step in, someone who can do something. Anything to keep the audience engaged." The nun didn't move. She didn't wave her hand or call out. But in her heart, she felt the softest nudge, as if life itself were asking her a question. She remained still, waiting for the right moment, trusting that if she were meant to stand, it would become clear. Near the back of the hall, two young performers were speaking nervously. "I can't go up there first," one said. "My nerves will eat me alive." "Same. I planned everything for later in the program." The other replied. "I'm not ready yet." Their voices reached the nun's ears, but she didn't judge. She understood fear, understood the weight of standing before many eyes. She had known that pressure long ago, but age had softened her fears, taught her patience, and shown her that moments often revealed themselves when people least expected. A soft chime came from the director's headset. She pressed her hand to it quickly. "Yes," she whispered. "Any update?" She paused, still stuck in traffic. Another pause. Her face fell. "Understood." She lowered her hand and closed her eyes briefly, gathering herself. When she opened them, she scanned the hall again, desperation quietly rising. The elderly nun could feel the moment tightening like a thread that wanted to break. She took a slow breath, letting it fill her chest with calm. She didn't stand yet. She simply prepared her heart, letting memories she had held for years drift gently to the surface. Memories of practice rooms filled with late afternoon light. Memories of music sheets worn soft by her fingers. Memories of audiences, applause, and the joy of letting music flow through her like something alive. But those memories had also been tucked away long ago when her path led her somewhere quieter, somewhere humbler. She had believed that part of her life was behind her, a door gently closed, and yet, here she was, sitting in a hall where a grand piano stood waiting. A volunteer stepped toward the stage again, lifted the microphone, and spoke softly to the director. "We can start with the choir instead," he suggested. "They're here already." "They're not warmed up," she replied, "and their equipment needs more setup." "Then maybe the guitar player?" "He isn't ready either." The director sighed deeply. "I just need one person who can get us through the next 10 minutes. The nun lowered her gaze. A soft warmth filled her chest, something quiet but persistent. She lifted her head and looked again at the piano. It stood waiting like a friend who had been silent for far too long. Something stirred inside her, something she hadn't felt in many years. And that was when the moment came. A volunteer near the stage caught sight of her. He didn't know why she drew his attention. Perhaps it was the calmness she carried, or the way her eyes lingered on the piano. Whatever it was, he hesitated, then walked toward her. He leaned down slightly. "Sister," he said softly, "earlier, you said you wanted to play?" She looked up at him, her eyes warm and steady. "Yes," she answered simply. The volunteer swallowed, unsure. Do you think you could play something now? Just something small?" The audience is waiting, and we don't have anyone else yet." The nun didn't answer right away. She looked toward the piano once more. She hadn't touched one in a long time, not in a way that mattered. But the thought of sitting before it again felt natural, almost like breathing. She turned back to the volunteer. "If it would help," she said softly, "I can try." The volunteer's eyes brightened with relief. "Thank you, sister. Let me tell the director." He hurried off, leaving her seated but no longer invisible. The audience sensed movement. People leaned in, curious. Some whispered as the volunteer rushed to the director and spoke quickly, pointing toward the nun. The director's eyebrows lifted in surprise. She glanced over at the elderly woman sitting quietly in the front row. For a moment, hesitation crossed her face, uncertainty, maybe even doubt. But then she nodded. "If she's willing," she said, "let her play." The volunteer returned to the nun, breathless but smiling. She said, "Yes, you can go up whenever you're ready." The nun rose slowly from her seat. Her knees complained a little, but she stood with grace, steady and calm. A quiet hush fell over the closest rows as people watched her. Some looked confused. Others looked amused, as if they weren't sure what to expect. A few smiled politely, curious but uncertain. She stepped into the aisle, her simple shoes tapping lightly against the floor. Each step carried a soft confidence, one that didn't demand attention but drew it anyway. The room seemed to shift as she walked, a gentle stillness following her like a shadow. The volunteers stepped aside to let her pass. The director watched her with a mixture of hope and worry. She wasn't sure what would happen. She wasn't sure if the nun could truly play, or if this would only make the situation more awkward. But she had no other choice. And something about the nun's calmness gave her a small sense of comfort. The nun reached the stage steps. A volunteer offered his arm to help her climb, and she accepted it with a grateful nod. The room grew quieter with each second. Even the children stopped whispering. She walked slowly across the stage floor toward the grand piano, her eyes softening as she approached. For a moment, she paused beside it, placing her hand gently on the polished wood. Her fingers brushed across its surface, and a quiet spark flickered in her eyes. Then she lowered herself onto the bench, her back straightening slightly, as though a familiar strength were returning to her. She placed her hands in her lap for a moment, breathing in deeply. The audience watched closely now, curious and unsure. The nun lifted her hands and rested them lightly on the keys, not pressing, just touching. The room grew so quiet that even the hum of the lights seemed to fade. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the memories settle, letting her heart prepare. She didn't rush. She didn't worry about the eyes watching her. She simply breathed, letting herself reconnect with something she had once loved deeply. And when she opened her eyes again, calm and full of quiet strength, she knew the moment had arrived. The stage was hers. The piano was hers. The silence around her waited, soft, expectant, full of possibility. She lifted her fingers slightly, ready to play, and just like that, everything began to change. The hall had grown so quiet that even the soft creak of the piano bench seemed loud. The elderly nun sat with her hands resting on the keys, not yet pressing them, just feeling their smooth surface. The audience waited, unsure of what was about to happen. Some watched with curiosity, others with doubt. A few whispered quietly, wondering if she truly knew how to play, or if she was simply filling time until the real performer arrived. But the nun didn't rush. She let the silence settle first, as if giving the room a moment to breathe. Her posture changed just a little, her back straightened, her shoulders relaxed. Something about her presence shifted, like a soft glow had awakened inside her. Those in the front row noticed it right away. The director, standing near the side of the stage, held her breath without realizing it. She had no idea what the nun would do. She had taken a risk out of desperation, hoping at least for a gentle tune to calm the crowd. But now, watching the nun at the piano, she felt a strange sense of anticipation, as though something unexpected was about to unfold. The nun finally lowered her fingers onto the keys. There was no hesitation in her touch, just gentle certainty. Then the first note sounded. It was soft, warm, almost like a whisper. It drifted through the air, touching the quiet hall with the grace of a falling feather. The audience leaned in subtly, drawn in by that single note. Then came the second, then a third. A slow, delicate melody began to form, each note placed with care, like someone stitching together a memory. The sound filled the space, not loud, not showy, but full of something deep and sincere. People who had been whispering fell into silence. Even the children who were restless moments earlier sat still, watching the nun's hands move with gentle precision. Her fingers floated across the keys effortlessly, as if they remembered the path they had once walked many times long ago. The director felt a surprising wave of relief wash over her. The nun wasn't just filling time, she was playing beautifully. The tune carried a kind of sweetness, something soft and comforting, like warmth from a window on a cold day. It wasn't a complicated piece, but it had a depth that reached people without needing to be grand or dramatic. The melody grew slightly stronger, the notes flowing like a story told without words. The nun's expression softened with each passing moment. Her eyes glimmered with distant memories, her face peaceful, as though she had slipped into a place only music could bring her. A man in the third row leaned toward his wife and whispered, "I didn't expect this." His wife nodded without taking her eyes off the stage. "She plays with so much feeling," she murmured. An older woman wiped at her eyes, surprised by her own reaction. She didn't know why the music touched her. She only knew that it did. The nun continued, letting the piece grow slowly, layer by layer. The melody rose gently, then fell, like waves rolling onto a quiet shore. Her hands moved gracefully, steady and sure, as if they had been waiting for this moment for decades. Someone in the back row whispered, "She must have played before, a long time ago." Another person replied, "You can't play like that without years of practice." But the nun wasn't thinking about her past success or hours of training. She wasn't thinking of audiences or old stages. She wasn't even thinking of the hall filled with people now watching her. She was simply present, completely present with the instrument she had once loved so deeply. Her heart played as much as her hands did. When the melody shifted into a richer section, the audience felt the change. The notes grew fuller, clearer, as though the piano itself had awakened. The sound filled the room like warm light, reaching every corner. Even the volunteers standing near the sides paused their work, drawn in despite themselves. A teenager who had rolled his eyes earlier now leaned forward, elbows on his knees, completely focused on the stage. A young mother held her child closer, and even the little one quieted, soothed by the gentle flow of the music. The director let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. A small smile touched her face. She glanced around the hall, seeing the audience soften, their frustration fading away. Something unplanned and unimagined was happening, something she had not expected when the nun first stepped forward. As the piece continued, the nun's hands moved with more strength, with confidence that surprised even her. She had not played publicly for so long, yet now, sitting here, she felt as if she had never stopped. The music rushed through her fingertips like water, flowing freely, naturally, without forcing. She reached a part of the melody that dipped into something more emotional, a tender reflection, a quiet sorrow mixed with hope. People felt it immediately. The hall hung onto every note. Some hearts tightened, others softened. Music had a way of speaking where words often failed, and the nun's playing spoke gently to anyone who listened with an open heart. A young man near the aisle whispered, "I don't know why, but this feels important." Someone behind him replied, "It's like she's telling a story without saying anything." The nun continued playing, her face serene, her movements steady and assured. For her, the music wasn't about impressing anyone. It was a prayer, a breath, a memory, a gift, and because it came from a place of sincerity, it reached people more deeply than any polished performance could. Minutes passed and yet time felt suspended. The audience didn't check their watches or look at their phones. They simply listened as if the music was something fragile they didn't want to break. Even the staff backstage, busy with cables and equipment, stepped out quietly to listen. They exchanged glances of surprise. Some smiled softly, touched by the unexpected moment unfolding before them. The nun moved into the final part of the piece. The notes softened again, becoming gentler, slower, like the last lines of a poem being whispered. Her fingers lingered on the keys, not rushing, not pushing. She let each note fall like a leaf drifting from a tree, settling softly into the silence around it. As the last few notes faded, the room held its breath. The sound hung in the air for a moment longer, delicate and light, before slipping away completely. The silence that followed was full, not empty, full of emotion, full of the soft echoes of what they had just heard. For several seconds, no one moved, no one clapped, no one even whispered. They simply absorbed the moment, stunned by the unexpected beauty they had just witnessed. The nun slowly lifted her hands from the keys and rested them quietly in her lap. She didn't look at the audience right away. Instead, she closed her eyes for a brief second, letting the moment settle inside her too. She felt grateful not for applause, not for attention but simply for the chance to play again, to speak through music once more. Finally, she opened her eyes and looked out into the hall. What she saw surprised her. People weren't staring with polite curiosity anymore. They were staring with awe, with respect, with a kind of wonder that made her heart soften even more. She had not expected this. She had only wanted to help. A single person began clapping, then another. Then the applause grew louder, spreading through the hall like a wave. People stood from their seats, one row after another, rising to their feet in appreciation. The sound became thunderous, yet warm, deeply warm. The nun bowed her head slightly, humble as always. She didn't bask in the attention. She simply acknowledged it with quiet gratitude. The director wiped her eyes, overwhelmed by relief and amazement. She stepped toward the stage with a new expression, one of respect, admiration, and something close to disbelief. She had thought the nun might fill time. Instead, she had opened something inside the entire room. Children clapped with wide-eyed excitement. Adults clapped with heartfelt emotion. Even those who had doubted her now found themselves cheering the loudest. The nun sat quietly through it all, her hands still resting in her lap, her expression gentle. She didn't need to say anything. The music had spoken for her, and though she didn't know it yet, this moment, this simple, quiet performance was about to ripple far beyond the walls of the hall. The world outside would soon hear what had happened here, and everything would change. The news about the elderly nun's performance spread faster than anyone expected. By the time the evening ended, people were already talking about her as if she had been a famous musician for years. The crowd that had watched her play could not stop discussing the moment. They heard those first powerful notes. Some described it as magical, others said it felt like the entire hall had changed in an instant. Many simply said they had never heard anything like it in their lives. Even those who had doubted her earlier now felt embarrassed, wondering how they could have been so quick to judge her. But more than anything else, they felt grateful for what they had witnessed. When the event ended, several people tried to approach the nun, hoping to speak with her or at least thank her. But she quietly slipped away from the stage, moving through the crowd with the same gentle steps she had used when she first arrived. She nodded politely to those who tried to stop her, but she did not stay long enough for conversation. In truth, she was overwhelmed by the applause and attention. She had never played for such a large audience in many years, and the emotions were still settling inside her. All she wanted was to return to her small room at the convent and sit in silence for a moment. As she walked outside, the cool air brushed her face, calming her. She looked up at the sky and whispered a small prayer of thanks, not for the attention she had received, but for the chance to share something meaningful. She had spent most of her life serving quietly, believing her days of performing had been left behind long ago. Yet somehow, life had brought her back to a piano, and for a brief moment, the world had listened. Meanwhile, inside the hall, one of the organizers was replaying the recording on his phone. His hands were shaking a little as he listened again to those beautiful notes. He hadn't expected this simple recording to capture such emotion, but it had. He looked around for the nun to interview her or ask about her training, but she was nowhere to be found. With a sense of urgency, he uploaded the video online so others could experience the moment too. He didn't think much about it, just felt others needed to hear it. By the next morning, everything had changed. The video had reached thousands of views, then hundreds of thousands. People from around the world commented with surprise and admiration. Musicians reacted with disbelief, saying her control, timing, and emotion showed the skill of a master. Some wondered who she was and why no one had heard of her before. Others guessed she must have been a great musician in her younger years. But the truth was even more touching than the guesses. At the convent, the elderly nun sat in the dining area, sipping tea with quiet contentment. She had no idea how quickly her performance was spreading until one of the younger sisters hurried in with excitement on her face. She held a small tablet in her hands and said that people all over the world were talking about the performance. At first, the nun thought she was exaggerating. How could the world be interested in a small moment like that? But when she saw the number of views, comments, and messages, she felt her breath catch. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It was strange to think that something she did simply from the heart had reached so many people. She often believed the world had forgotten the importance of simple things: music, kindness, patience. But maybe it hadn't. Maybe people were still searching for beauty, even if they didn't always say it. The convent began receiving calls from reporters. Some asked about her musical history. Others wanted to know how an ordinary nun could play like a professional. But the nun gently refused most interviews. She didn't want attention or praise. She said she was grateful people liked the music, but her life had never been about fame. Her only wish was that the performance would bring others peace or joy. As more people learned her story, they discovered she had once trained at a respected music academy in her youth. She had shown exceptional promise and had even been invited to perform internationally. But a sudden illness in her family changed the direction of her life. She left her dreams behind and dedicated herself to service instead. To her, sacrificing her musical career had not been a regret, but a duty she fulfilled with love. Still, she never fully abandoned music. She played in private moments, late at night when the convent was quiet. Music had always been her silent companion, her way of expressing emotions she could never put into words. But she never imagined it would one day be heard by millions. Over the next few days, letters arrived from all around the world. People wrote to say her performance comforted them through stress, sadness, or loneliness. Some said it reminded them of a loved one. Others said it inspired them to pick up an old hobby they had abandoned years earlier. It amazed her how deeply a single piece of music could touch so many different lives. The organist at a nearby church invited her to play again, saying the community would be honored. She politely declined at first, feeling shy at the idea of performing publicly again. But deep inside, a small spark had been reignited. Music was a gift, and perhaps it was time to share it again, not for fame, not for applause, but for the simple joy it brought to others. Finally, after gentle encouragement, she agreed to play at the local church for a small gathering. She hoped it would be quiet and peaceful, without cameras or noise. But when she arrived, she found the seats filled with people of all ages, children, parents, elderly couples, all waiting with warm smiles. There were no flashing lights, no reporters, just ordinary people who wanted to hear her play. When she sat at the old wooden piano, her hands rested on the keys for a moment. She closed her eyes and took a slow breath, remembering the feeling she had missed for so long. Then she began to play. The sound floated through the church like a soft wind, gentle but full of meaning. This time, the music carried something deeper, a sense of connection between her and everyone listening. When the last note faded, the room stayed silent for a few seconds, not because people were unsure what to do, but because they didn't want the moment to end. Then the applause came, warm and heartfelt. The nun smiled quietly, humbled and grateful. She walked home afterward with a lightness in her steps. She knew life wouldn't suddenly change into something extraordinary. She would still follow her routines, still serve quietly, still live simply. But one thing had changed. She now understood that the gifts she once thought were meant for the past still had a place in the present, and without realizing it, she had reminded the world that talent, no matter how hidden or forgotten, can shine again when the time is right. Her story was not about fame or recognition. It was about the beauty of second chances, the courage to step forward, and the power of sharing something pure. Many people would remember her performance for years, but for the elderly nun, the greatest reward was knowing her music had touched hearts far beyond the walls of the hall. And in her quiet room that night, as she whispered a prayer of thanks, she felt at peace, grateful that even in the later years of her life, she had been given a moment to bring light to others through the simple touch of a piano.